What really happened in the final hours of Amon Goeth, the man known as the Butcher of Płaszów? From a life of unchecked cruelty to a death that defied even the hangman's plan, this is the chilling downfall of one of history's most sadistic killers. Witness the shocking truth of how the man who once declared himself a god fell trembling before the noose. Inside his trial, his last words, and the eerie twist that turned his execution into a scene no one could forget. This is the story they never told you about the monster who finally met justice. Stay with us, because what happened at that gallows will leave you speechless. The year was 1938, and Vienna was erupting with euphoria. German troops had crossed the border into Austria, and as Adolf Hitler's motorcade rolled through cheering crowds, thousands saluted with blind devotion. Among them stood a young man with sharp eyes and a smile that did not match the occasion. His name was Amon Goeth, and while the rest of Vienna celebrated unity, he saw only opportunity. What the crowd felt as national pride, he felt as personal destiny. Born into comfort in 1908, Goeth grew up in a well-off Catholic household where appearances mattered more than affection. His father owned a publishing company, and his mother managed it when she wasn't traveling. Left in the care of relatives, Amon learned early how to mask emotions, how to command attention, and how to hide cruelty behind charm. He showed no passion for learning, no patience for rules, only a hunger for influence. His teenage years revealed the beginnings of obsession. He enrolled in agricultural studies but abandoned them almost immediately, calling them a waste of time for men who were meant to lead. The young Austrian drifted into his parents' business, but found books dull compared to the thrill of the new political storm sweeping through Europe. He attended secret meetings, memorized Nazi slogans, and began parroting Hitler's vision of a pure Reich. When Austria's government banned the Nazi Party in 1933, Goeth didn't retreat. He became a fanatic. He smuggled weapons and radio equipment across borders, serving as a courier for the underground movement. The police chased him, and newspapers called men like him traitors in their own nation. But Goeth wore that label like a medal. His arrests only hardened him, and his short imprisonment taught him the power of intimidation. By his mid-20s, he was already fluent in the language of fear. What few knew then was how calculated his ambition had become. He wasn't driven by ideology, but by the promise of dominance. He wanted to rise fast, no matter the cost. When Austrian Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss was assassinated by Nazi conspirators in 1934, Goeth slipped across the border into Germany, joining a network that rewarded ruthlessness with advancement. He saw bloodshed not as horror, but as proof of loyalty. Years later, as Hitler annexed Austria, Goeth returned home, draped in pride. He was no longer an exile. He was part of the machine that had conquered without firing a shot. Vienna's Jewish citizens scrubbed the streets in humiliation as Goeth passed by, wearing the SS uniform that now defined him. He watched suffering unfold and felt none. To him, it was order, not evil. Every humiliation fed the illusion that he was chosen to command. Marriage soon followed. In 1938, he wed Anna Geiger, a young woman he met at a motorcycle race. Their SS wedding was a ceremony of purity tests and Aryan ideals, where love meant loyalty to the Reich. He smiled for photographs, hiding the arrogance that already defined him. Behind that smile was a man learning that power could be addictive and cruelty could be useful. By the time World War II began, Amon Goeth had traded books for bullets. The former apprentice of his father's publishing house had become a soldier of Hitler's empire, trained to see obedience as virtue and mercy as weakness. His rise through the SS ranks was only beginning, and those who served under him would soon discover what kind of man he truly was. How did a man raised in comfort transform into one of history's most sadistic executioners? Stay with us as the mystery deepens. The road to Płaszów. When the first bombs fell on Poland in September 1939, Amon Goeth was no longer a restless dreamer in uniform. He was part of the machine that brought terror with precision. He had joined the SS with the rank of Hauptsturmführer, a captain's insignia that gleamed with promise. But it wasn't the rank that changed him. It was the authority. For Goeth, the war wasn't about conquest or ideology. It was about the intoxicating power to decide who lived and who did not. He was soon sent to Lublin, where the Nazi extermination network was taking shape under SS leader Odilo Globoknik. There, Operation Reinhard was being planned, a system to erase Poland's Jewish population. 3 killing centers, Bełżec, Sobibor and Treblinka, were already swallowing thousands. Goeth didn't kill with his own hands yet. His role was colder. He handled transport lists, logistics, and labor assignments and words that disguised the slaughter they enabled. Each document he signed was a silent death sentence. In the spring of 1942, Goeth began visiting the ghettos of southern Poland. He walked through Kraków, Tarnów, and Bochnia as if he were inspecting a factory floor. The smell of decay, the cries of children, the thin silhouettes lining the streets, none of it disturbed him. Witnesses recalled how he watched roundups with amusement, remarking once that efficiency was the highest form of mercy. In truth, he had found his stage. Those months hardened his image among the SS. He was seen as reliable, obedient, and disturbingly enthusiastic. When the order came to build a new labor camp outside Kraków, Goeth was chosen without hesitation. His record promised results. The site, selected in early 1943, was no ordinary ground. It was built directly over 2 Jewish cemeteries, where gravestones were crushed under concrete. For Goeth, it was poetic. Even the dead would serve him now. Construction began under brutal conditions. Thousands of prisoners from nearby ghettos worked through freezing nights with no food, carrying stone until their hands bled. Goeth inspected daily, walking among them with polished boots and a riding crop. The first gallows were erected before the first barracks were finished. It was a warning. This was not a camp for survival. It was a camp for submission. The SS headquarters congratulated Goeth for his efficiency. They saw results. They didn't see the eyes of the dying. Within weeks, Płaszów began to resemble a small city of despair, divided by fences, governed by fear. Goeth's name started circulating in whispers among guards and prisoners alike. To some, he was brilliant. To others, he was unhinged. But no one doubted one truth. The man who had once hidden behind ideology had now become something darker, a man who believed he was the law. And when he finally stood before the prisoners to deliver his first command, they heard the words that sealed their fate. "I am your God." What happens when a man begins to believe his own madness? Come with us to explore the hidden corners of the story. I am your God. The words hung in the air like a curse. Prisoners stared at the man before them, tall, severe, his SS uniform immaculate, his voice steady as stone. "I am your God," Amon Goeth declared, and in that instant thousands understood that the nightmare had a face. From his hilltop villa, Goeth ruled Płaszów like a kingdom of death. The camp spread across 200 acres of barbed wire, guard towers and mud. Each dawn began with a whistle and ended with screams. He rose early, walked to his balcony, and scanned the crowd below through his rifle's sights. Anyone who moved too slowly became target practice. Witnesses said the morning breeze often carried a single echo, one sharp crack, followed by silence. The camp was divided into rigid sections, men to one side, women to another, Poles in a separate zone. Every inch was a hierarchy of fear. Beneath Goeth's command, Ukrainian guards patrolled with dogs trained to tear apart prisoners on command. 2 of them, Rolf and Ralph, became extensions of his cruelty. Survivors later recalled how their barking froze the blood faster than the sound of his gun. Inside his office, the veneer of order hid chaos. Files were stacked like trophies, records of prisoners, confiscated property, and death counts scribbled in ink. Goeth treated paperwork as sport, signing execution orders with the same calm he might use to approve a dinner menu. His mood dictated life or death. A forgotten salute, an unwashed shirt, a glance held too long, all could end with a single gesture from his gloved hand. Rumors spread through the camp faster than bullets. It was said he sometimes drank before roll call, his laughter echoing as bodies fell. On certain mornings, prisoners tried to stay perfectly still, terrified his balcony window might open. Others whispered that his hat, a Tyrolean cap, was the omen. When he wore it, someone would die before noon. Despite the carnage, Goeth demanded perfection. Prisoners working in the factories produced goods for the Reich, but if a shoe was the wrong size or a machine broke, punishment was immediate. He shot one tailor for a crooked seam, another for daring to wipe sweat from his face. In his world, suffering was discipline and killing was order. He dined each night in luxury while his victims starved beneath his feet. His villa overflowed with stolen furniture, paintings and silverware seized from murdered families. Yet what unsettled those around him most wasn't his greed, it was his calm. He killed without rage, without hesitation, as if each death proved his divine right to rule. By mid-1943, even some SS officers whispered that the commandant of Płaszów had lost his humanity. But they feared him too much to intervene. To the outside world, he was a loyal officer. To those behind the fences, he was a god who answered only to death. How does a god respond when desire grows beyond mere fear? Stay here as the next twist unfolds. The Devil's Table. By late 1943, Amon Goeth's reign at Płaszów had become more than tyranny, it had become theatre. Each day unfolded as a grotesque performance where he played every role, judge, executioner, and god. But when night fell and the gunfire quieted, another world came alive inside his villa, a world of indulgence that mocked the suffering beyond its walls. The villa overlooked the camp like a watchtower carved from privilege. It was filled with chandeliers, thick carpets, and velvet curtains looted from Jewish homes. On the table lay silver cutlery engraved with Hebrew initials, a cruel reminder of those who once owned them. Beneath that glittering surface, the house pulsed with a sickness far worse than violence, pleasure without conscience. Goeth's evenings were infamous among the SS who served under him. He invited officers, secretaries, and occasionally visiting dignitaries to dine at his long wooden table, what they called the Devil's Table. There was laughter, music, and an endless flow of vodka and cognac. While the prisoners starved on watery soup, he feasted on roasted meats and fine bread baked by slaves in the camp kitchens. When his mood turned dark, the entertainment shifted. Servants trembled as he ordered them to pour drinks while standing beside the open balcony, the same spot where he killed at dawn. Those close to him saw the duality of his madness. By day, he was methodical, precise. By night, unrestrained. Alcohol unlocked what the uniform contained. One evening, in a drunken rage, he ordered a cook shot because the soup was too hot for his taste. Another time, he beat a stable boy unconscious for saddling his horse incorrectly. His fury was unpredictable, yet his cruelty always had purpose, to remind everyone that their lives belonged to him. Amid this chaos, Goeth developed a taste for excess that reached beyond violence. His villa became a den of moral decay. Witnesses later described late-night gatherings filled with screaming laughter, where he forced servants to drink until they collapsed. On several occasions, women prisoners were dragged from the barracks to serve as entertainment, then vanished before sunrise. It was no longer just murder, it was domination taken to its most twisted extreme. Among the servants who lived under his command was a young Jewish maid named Helen Jonas. She would later recount how even silence could be dangerous around him. Once, entering the villa to deliver a message, she found him drunk and naked, holding a whip. He ordered her to undress. When she refused, he lashed her across the back until she collapsed. The next morning, he acted as if nothing had happened, greeting her with a smile and asking for coffee. His world operated by one rule: pleasure for him, pain for everyone else. Yet even within the SS, whispers began to circulate. Officers from Kraków who visited the camp left uneasy. Some spoke of his growing arrogance, his open theft of valuables, his disregard for orders. He had begun hoarding money, diamonds and artwork, sending shipments to Vienna under false names. Every piece of loot was catalogued, not as stolen property, but as trophies of his service. His greed did not go unnoticed. By mid-1944, reports of corruption reached higher command. Investigators discovered crates of valuables hidden in railcars near a power station, goods Goeth had claimed for himself. But still, his reputation for brutality shielded him. Few dared confront him directly. Even his subordinates feared that challenging him meant death before dawn. Yet the cracks in his empire were widening. His health was faltering, his drinking worse, and his paranoia growing. He accused officers of conspiring against him, ordered random searches, and executed men on suspicion alone. Those who once praised his efficiency now called him unstable. Still, he believed himself untouchable, the master of Płaszów, chosen by fate to rule through terror. But power built on blood never lasts. Behind the laughter at his dinner table, the Reich itself was beginning to crumble. And as German lines collapsed across Europe, the man who once stood above thousands would soon find the ground vanishing beneath his boots. Can the devil withstand the moment when he is held accountable for his own sins? Join us as the secrets grow even darker. The fall of the butcher. The walls of Goeth's empire began to crack long before he noticed. By late 1944, the war that had once crowned him master of life and death was now turning against the Reich. Soviet troops were advancing. The air smelled of ash and loss, and for the first time Amon Goeth's voice trembled, not from fear of enemies, but from fear of losing control. Rumors had already reached Kraków headquarters. Someone was stealing from the Reich's property, gold teeth, jewelry, and foreign currency once seized from murdered prisoners had vanished. The trail led straight back to Płaszów. When investigators followed it, they found trunks packed with carpets, furs, and diamonds waiting on railcars near Opowa station, all marked for personal storage. It was Goeth's signature arrogance that betrayed him. He had written his name on the manifests himself. The Gestapo arrived without warning. One September morning, the same boots that had stomped across Płaszów's parade ground now echoed in his villa, but this time they were not his. He was still in uniform when they entered, a half-finished glass of cognac on the table beside him. They read the charges aloud: theft, embezzlement, and unauthorized brutality. Goeth laughed at first, certain his reputation would protect him. Yet when the handcuffs closed around his wrists, the room fell silent. He was taken to a cell in Kraków, stripped of his command, and questioned by men he once considered comrades. They asked about missing valuables, about his black market dealings, about the trains. He tried to charm them, to shift blame onto subordinates, but his name had become a liability. The same ruthlessness that had earned him power now made him dangerous to those above him. As the investigation deepened, more secrets emerged. Witnesses spoke of shipments addressed to Vienna under false names, of bribes paid to SS officers, and of Goeth's drunken excesses. Even his former staff confessed to his unhinged behavior. His beloved dogs, Rolf and Ralph, were found starved in the kennels. His once polished villa stood ransacked, its cupboards empty, the scent of rot hanging in the air. For the first time, Goeth had no one left to command. The prisoners he had ruled with terror were gone. The camp was being dismantled as the front drew closer. Without victims, he was just another man in chains. Still, he refused to show remorse. When SS doctors examined him, they described a man suffering from severe mental instability, a diagnosis that likely spared him from immediate execution. He was transferred to a psychiatric hospital near Bad Tölz, where the once feared commandant now muttered to himself, haunted by invisible orders that no longer existed. By the time Allied forces reached Germany, Goeth's arrogance had hardened into delusion. He still wore his uniform when American soldiers captured him, pretending to be a regular Wehrmacht officer. The deception didn't last long. They recognized his face from witness statements and photographs of the Płaszów camp. When they shackled him again, he no longer laughed. The man who once ruled over 20,000 souls now awaited judgment for every bullet, every scream, every name scratched into the walls of his camp. Extradition to Poland followed quickly. Kraków, the city that once feared him, now prepared to put him on trial. The streets he had turned to dust were alive again, filled with survivors who had lived long enough to testify. As he was led into the Supreme National Tribunal in August 1946, reporters described his expression as cold, almost amused. He still believed he could outwit the world one last time. During questioning, Goeth denied everything. He dismissed witness accounts as exaggerations and insisted he had merely followed orders. When survivors described the morning shootings, the dogs, and the torture, he polished his fingernails and smirked. The court called him a monster, but he saw himself as a soldier betrayed by circumstance. By the end of the hearings, even his arrogance could not shield him. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimonies relentless. Goeth was found guilty on all counts: mass murder, crimes against humanity, and the destruction of the Kraków and Tarnów ghettos. He was sentenced to death. The butcher of Płaszów, once untouchable, was now waiting for the rope. But even his execution would not go as planned. Stay close as the layers continue to peel back. The rope and the river. The prison cell in Kraków was small, cold, and silent. For the first time in his life, Amon Goeth had no one to command, no one to fear him, no one to serve him. The butcher of Płaszów, the man who once stood on a balcony playing God with a rifle, now stared at the cracked walls of his cell as if waiting for them to obey. But there were no orders left to give, and no one left to follow them. Outside, the city was rebuilding from ashes. The same streets where he once rode in a car stolen from murdered families were now filled with people rebuilding homes and lives. Survivors whispered his name not in fear, but in fury. Some waited outside the courtroom each morning just to see the man who had terrorized their existence dragged in chains. For them, his trial was more than justice. It was resurrection. The hearings drew crowds from across Poland. The tribunal hall echoed with the voices of witnesses who had seen the unspeakable. One after another, they described horrors he had long forgotten. A mother recounted the day he shot her child for dropping a bucket. A tailor remembered working while bodies hung outside his workshop. A former servant spoke of scrubbing blood from the villa's floors. Each testimony was a mirror forcing Goeth to face what he had created. He responded with the same arrogance that had once defined him. To the judges, he was calm and detached, claiming he had merely carried out military orders. When asked about the killings, he called them necessary discipline. He insisted that every soldier of the Reich had to make hard decisions. Even as the walls closed in, he refused to see himself as anything less than a commander fulfilling his duty. But the world no longer listened to men like him. The evidence was overwhelming. Photographs of Płaszów's graves, testimonies from guards, documents signed in his hand. Every page bore the weight of thousands of lives extinguished under his command. When the verdict came on September 5, 1946, the courtroom fell silent. Amon Goeth was sentenced to death by hanging. He showed no emotion, no apology, no recognition of the crimes that defined his existence. When asked for a final statement, he simply said, "I was a soldier. I did my duty." It was not remorse. It was pride disguised as resignation. For a week, he waited in his cell, pacing, muttering to himself. Guards reported hearing him issue German orders into the air, as if commanding invisible soldiers. At night, he refused food and spoke to no one. The man who once lived for control was now trapped in the one place he could not dominate, his own mind. The morning of his execution arrived with a chill that clung to every wall of Montelupic prison. Led from his cell by two guards, his wrists bound tightly, he walked with surprising calm, chin high, posture straight. Yet his eyes betrayed something hollow, as if even he no longer believed in the myth he had built. In the courtyard stood a wooden scaffold, the same place the Gestapo once used for executions. Now it was Goeth's turn beneath the noose. As he climbed the steps, he whispered to the priest, then shouted, "Heil Hitler!" It was his final act of defiance, or his final confession that he was nothing without the creed that created him. Even death denied him dignity. The first drop failed. The rope was too long. The second slipped loose. Only on the third attempt did it hold. His body jerked, then went still. The man who once claimed to be God died gasping like every mortal he condemned. He was 37. His ashes were scattered in the Vistula River, a nameless current washing away the last trace of the butcher of Płaszów. In the weeks after his death, survivors returned to the land where his camp once stood. The fences were gone, the watchtowers dismantled, the barracks empty. Yet, beneath the soil, fragments remained, shards of bone, scraps of clothing, echoes of 1,000 cries. Children played there now, unaware that beneath their feet lay the unmarked graves of those whose lives had built their freedom. Amon Goeth's name faded into history, but the stories of those he tried to erase did not. They spoke of defiance, of survival, of the triumph of humanity over cruelty. In every survivor's testimony, his power died again, and in every retelling, the victims reclaimed what he once stole from them, their voice. There were no tears for Amon Goeth, only silence, the kind that comes not from fear, but from closure. He believed he was eternal, but in the end, even gods fall silent. Were you stunned by the untold final moments of the butcher of Płaszów, and how his own arrogance led to a fate more haunting than death itself? Share your thoughts below and tell us, do you believe true justice was ever possible for a man like Amon Goeth?